And we are live. Welcome. This is the 6th episode of the Geoconservative Files. Today I have on Mr. Charlemagne, a neo-reactionary YouTuber.
Hello.
Charlemagne. So Charlemagne, tell me a little bit about your channel.
So my channel mainly focuses on reactionary thought and neo-reactionary thought, I would say, with an emphasis on taking some older works and providing explanations for them within a modern context. I have my main series is on Mencius Moldbug's Open Letter to Open-Minded Progressives, where I sort of take some of the key ideas in the letter and present them in a format that can be more easily digested than reading the entire thing. And I've also done this with a few of his other blog posts, as well as covered a few other neo-reactionaries like Nick Land and reactionaries in general like Julius Evola, René Guénon, and a few videos on World War II or fascism. So yeah, generally just right-wing reactionary content, sometimes analysis, sometimes more just explanation. I would say the goal of my channel is mostly to disseminate information to the dissident right that I think they'll find useful at that particular moment in time. And I also try to keep my content evergreen as much as possible and not embed it too much in the I guess mainstream political flow. That way, you can pretty much watch it now or hopefully 10 years in the future and still gain something from it, hopefully an understanding of neo-reaction. So yeah, that's my channel.
So you would best describe your channel as like sort of a video, I don't know, a video database or encyclopedia of all these kinds of neo-reactionary ideas, sort of made accessible to the average person.
Maybe not the average person, but to some extent, yeah. I think I'm trying to build up an archive of useful videos for people to understand concepts that are outside of the Overton window.
So yeah, I think that you know one of my friends, Todd Lewis, who I've had on this show before. One of the things he's really harped on about is how PragerU is so popular on YouTube and so successful. Its formula of trying to boil down these kinds of normie conservative ideas into 5 minute video, these kinds of 5 to 10 minute videos that are very accessible to the average person. Would you say your channel is a bit like that, or is it a bit more like something like the Distributist, where it's very long-winded?
It's definitely more like PragerU. That doesn't feel like much of a compliment. I think that I like the Distributist channel as well. He tends to focus more on long form, I guess, ideation, and his videos have a very narrative feel to them, and they feel a bit more, I guess, emotive, whereas my content's a bit more dry and explanatory. And I think there's definitely room for both, and it's good to have contents of many varieties for people to listen to. But yeah, I would agree with that. I'm mostly focused on explaining things in a way that's easily digestible. And PragerU does do that very well. They have a really good graphical style that's consistent, and that's really something that's good to aim for when you're producing content. I sort of developed a bit of a style on my own when I started doing bug videos. That's kind of when I consider my channel to have started. I've been on YouTube since 2007. Just I've had an account way back when, and I didn't really upload. It was just back then YouTube was really young, and I uploaded a few gaming videos and stuff. And when I was more liberal, I uploaded some political videos. But I think the first mold bug video is really where I could the start of my channel, where things have a more or less consistent style and theme to them.
All right. Well, that transitions nicely to my next question. How did you come to have the views you have today? I mean, Neoreaction isn't exactly a common view.
Yeah, I would say that's through the magic of Discord. So I started hanging around on Discord maybe 3 or 4 years ago. When Jordan Peterson got really big, I found that there was a Jordan Peterson Discord, and I didn't know what Discord was at the time, really. But it was fun, and way back in the day, uh, in like the '90s and early 2000s, I would hang out on internet forums and sometimes chat in games like RuneScape or older games and stuff like that. So it was an enjoyable experience for me to kind of be in a chat room setting again. And so I got to talk to a lot of people, and I gotten to voice chats with lots of people, and I found it really, really interesting because there were all kinds of people on Discord with all manner of ideas that you had never heard of before. And someone had mentioned Mencius Moldbug a couple of times, and eventually I made a point to go ahead and read this Moldbug guy. And so I started with the open letter to open-minded progressives, and I just found the whole thing utterly gripping, and it provided a clarity of understanding to what was going on in American politics that I couldn't get from anywhere else. Everything just clicked for me immediately as I read the letter. I had never encountered any explanation like this that just made sense of so many things, like about why the political system was broken. A lot of people, I was more like, I don't know, I guess centrist minded back then, and a lot of people have this conception that the government's broken, the system's broken, that voting doesn't really matter. The parties aren't really different, but I had never really read any theory behind why it's like this or what the actual mechanisms of power were. So I found it really, really compelling. Ironically, I read the open letter in its entirety about probably just a month before I took a very long trip to Washington, D.C. to kind of visit the Capitol almost as a pilgrimage as an American to see all of the monuments and the Constitution and all of that. So I wound up having a very different experience there that I actually really enjoyed because I was going to the city as an almost pseudo-religious experience, but that was my intent. But when I had actually gotten there and I had all these neo-reactionary ideas in my head, I felt like I was more or less viewing the remains of some fallen civilization because I had this understanding that all of this stuff I'm looking at in these museums, this doesn't really exist anymore. And there's kind of just this big lie built on top of it. And I found that a really interesting experience that really solidified the neo-reactionary way of thinking in my head. So this was back in like November 2017. Yeah, it was when I went, and that's really when I kind of went full on neo-reactionary in my way of thinking. So then I also read Moldbug's what's the other one? Not the open letter, the Gentle Introduction. I read that, which was also very good and funny. I really like Moldbug's writing style, and a few other of his blog posts, as well as Nick Land and Spangel and a few other guys. And yeah, I just found the whole way of thinking really interesting. Very funny, novel, and it just explains everything about the power dynamics of American politics in a way that makes complete sense.
I myself, when I was first researching these kinds of neo-reactionary ideas, I would sort of, one of the things I do is, I try and look at, when I come across a new idea, I try to find something like, okay, who in my view, in my camp, has criticized this idea before? And what do the criticisms of this idea really stand against the neo-reactionary, ideas? And what I found is that, the neo-reactionaries, while I may disagree with, some of their solutions, like monarchy — I'm not a monarchist — when it comes to their analysis of the analysis and things like the cathedral and the uniparty, the sort of conservative and liberal establishment types did not really have a good answer to they it seemed like they had to, and this is something that that annoys me to no end. It seemed like they had to ignore entire things that were happening all these things that were actually happening in the real world in order to make their point, and sometimes even ignore what Moldbug was actually saying, and try to focus. A lot of the critiques of Moldbug focused mainly on how, oh, he's a nut job because he's a monarchist or something like that, or oh, he's a racist. That's a great critique. Yeah, sure.
And then, of course,
anyway,
neocameralism. They'll call him crazy for his proposed solution.
I mean, I read there's a guy named Fred Foldberry. He's a left-wing libertarian. He's a leftist libertarian type, a geo-libertarian. His writings helped make me into a Georgist, and he has these ideas of cellular democracy and ethno-federalism, and those kinds of ideas have a lot of overlap with Moldbug's idea of neocameralism, except it's a bit more. Except as a leftist, he's a bit more in line with democracy. Basically, he has the idea that we'll have these tiny cells, societies that are democratically run, and these cells can kind of bunch together and form a bigger democratic whole. But if the bigger democratic whole makes a decision that one of the cells doesn't like, that cell can separate from the whole at any time.
Yeah, that's more like patchwork.
Yeah, it is very much patchwork, but it's like left libertarian patchwork, and he also has ethno-federalism, which is the idea that, it's his theory that a lot of ethnic conflict is caused by, ethnic groups fighting over natural resources in a given area. And so the solution is basically self-segregation combined with redistribution of the fruits of natural resources. The private property, it's a part of Georgism, you see, that resources extracted from nature directly are common property, but things that are directly created through the fruits of one's labor, those are private property. And when it comes to private property, Georgists are about as strict about that as ANCAPs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a very Lockean way of thinking.
Oh yeah. Georgism is derived from John Locke's thinking, and in fact, it's found in a lot of Henry George's ideas are precursed foreshadowed in a lot of the Enlightenment thinkers like Thomas Paine, Thomas Jefferson, Adam Smith, David Ricardo. People like that. But enough about that. I'd like to know a little bit more about neoreaction. How would you describe neoreaction?
I think neoreaction is fundamentally a diagnosis of the specific problems that exist now in the 21st century. It's not really, it's not a complete philosophy of life. It doesn't even necessarily provide solutions. It's primarily about explaining what the actual mechanisms of power are that we currently live in, and provide some historical context and explanation for how they've evolved. Now, of course, there are several branches of neoreaction, mainly three. You have sort of the more traditionalist branch, you have the sort of hyper-capitalist branch, and then you have, I suppose, the more ethnic nationalist branch. I think probably if you had to pick one, I think the Moldbug kind of encapsulates the mainline neoreaction, and then you have more Land's accelerationist reaction, and a few other bloggers like Spandrel. But I think it's primarily about not so much about solutions. We talked a bit about neocameralism, or mentioned it, and I think the distributist mentioned this before. I think Moldbug kind of put in neocameralism into his essay because he kind of felt like he had to say something and on how to actually fix the problem. I think neocameralism is kind of a goofy post-libertarian thought experiment more than anything. It's interesting and kind of entertaining to think about, but really take it that seriously. And I think most of the criticisms of it are kind of pointless because I think even Moldbug and other neo-reactionaries would admit that it's kind of just a silly thought experiment. So neo-reaction is all about diagnosis, not necessarily about providing solutions. And that's not something I really do on my channel either. It's very rare that I actually make specific recommendations on what you should do. I don't even necessarily believe wholesale every single thing I make a video about, right? I make videos about Evola, about Moldbug, and about land. And of course, I don't agree completely with all of these people. I'm just trying to give you tools that can help you think in different ways to help deal with modernity. And that's really what neo-reaction is about, is helping you frame the problems of modernity so that you can hopefully come up with something in the future. It's kind of like the groundwork for providing an answer. Neo-reaction doesn't really give you an answer. It just tells you what's wrong. And that's, of course, you have to understand in a very specific way what the problem actually is before you go about trying to solve it. And of course, that's what the kind of regular conservatives miss. You sort of mentioned this earlier, how they don't really have answers to certain things, or they have to just kind of ignore them. And often what you see in kind of everyday conservatism playing some of these things is some grand Marxist conspiracy theory or something like that. But neo-reaction is attractive to me because it doesn't have any conspiracy theory to it. It provides a very straightforward evolutionary way in which the cathedral evolved in this decentralized manner to control society. And it just makes complete sense of things. You don't have to think in any conspiratorial way because there is no grand conspiracy behind it. And I think that's really one of the strengths of neo-reaction compared to other explanatory means, is that you don't have to be a conspiracy theorist to be a neo-reactionary. In fact, it's very much the opposite.
So, I mean, yeah, there's a lot you've said, and I think a lot of it I agree with, some of it which I could push back on. Yeah, I guess one thing I'll push back on is, just because you have a really good explanation of how it could evolve naturally in an evolutionary way, I mean, there is historical evidence that groups like the CIA have been involved in the entertainment industry. You have things like Project Mockingbird, where the CIA can has basically influenced the media apparatus. These kinds of conspiracies have happened in the past. And in fact, I remember reading somewhere that the very word conspiracy theory is essentially a scare word, a buzzword, or what distributors would call a magic word, used by people in the CIA and spread around to try and discredit those who were questioning the official narrative, so to speak.
Yeah, all of those things definitely happen, and there's certainly a mix of both, I suppose, natural power processes happening to form the current power structure we have, and also these intentional actions by the CIA or globalists or other groups. But I think, I wouldn't deny that those things are happening and are influential. But I think the key to neo-reaction is that Moldbug doesn't really mention any of that in his essay. You get this complete explanation that doesn't require you to think about these dark, murky, not entirely proven things that are happening behind the scenes. You kind of just get a more straightforward understanding that normal people can consume and not be immediately pushed away like they would be by some of the things you just mentioned. I think it's a kind of a stepping stone process for a lot of people to actually get to the point where, you know, they can acknowledge these conspiracies.
Indeed. So you would say that the neo-reactionary worldview is sort of a diagnosis of the modern day. How would you summarize this diagnosis?
I would say that the main diagnosis is that the power structure of modernity, which we call the cathedral, is this massive decentralized network of institutions that are all self-reinforcing, and thus there's no specific weakness in the system, and there's no leader, which makes it operate mostly invisibly behind the scenes. And yet it's still there. Functionally, you can see it there, but it's difficult to point out. It's difficult to point out what the thing is as a whole without the neo-reactionary theory. So the gist of it, I suppose, is the keystone of the neo-reactionary power theory of the cathedral is the universities. The universities are really what the cathedral formally refers to, although it really means just all of the institutions in general now. But the universities are sort of the religious center of modernity, and this is something that Moldbug very deftly explains, that we're basically living under an atheistic religion, a no God religion, where the scientific knowledge given to us by the priests at the universities essentially provide us with a progressive religion, and we're basically not there is no separation of church and state in the society we live in, even though that's supposed to be guaranteed by our First Amendment. The universities have essentially smuggled a religion under the door by removing God from the equation. So we're in a system where there's a no God religion, and the priests of right and wrong, who are the professors at the universities, basically tell us how we're supposed to be living, and that is in the progressive way. And governments and other institutions adopt this religious dogma due to the fact that the universities are basically regarded as the center of knowledge and what is true. And of course, Neoreaction also explains to us how politicians, on paper, they have power, but in reality, they aren't actually the wielders of power in the United States. It's the universities, it's the press, it's lobbyists, it's other background institutions, the deep state, as we call it, the sort of embedded civil service. All of these people who aren't elected, who are simply there. Hired potentially decades ago, who have adopted these progressive views that they have gotten from the cathedral, from the universities. And this is the real system of power in the United States. And it explains things like, why can't President Trump just do whatever he wants? Why can't he just enact his agenda? And it's because the president isn't this very powerful figure like we think he is. The power is actually residing in these deep institutions that are very difficult to point out specifically and also displace because they're decentralized. Decentralization is really the key word behind the cathedral. This is a common idea in computer networks now that make them more resilient to attack. Any network that is decentralized can't be taken down by severing a single link in the chain, because there's always other reinforcing aspects to it. And this is exactly how the cathedral works. So I think that's pretty much the summary of the neo-reactionary frame of reference.
So yeah, I think that's that there is a lot of interesting ideas behind that. So I mean, two things that come to mind though is that I mean, some Democrat could look trying to refute the idea of the cathedral, could point to a Republican-dominated Congress and the president and the conservative-dominated Supreme Court, and how there's all these conservative media networks that challenge the liberal monopoly on media, and they could say, well, doesn't this look like there's a second cathedral here?
Right. Well, that's of course a criticism that will always come up, but that's one of the most easily dispelled ones. In the first part of his open letter, Moldbug has this really great line: "Cthulhu may swim slowly, but he always swims left." Isn't that interesting? And the thing is, and you can see it almost on a daily basis with President Trump, is that it doesn't really matter if on paper. Moldbug actually even talks about this in one part of the letter in an argument with his dad. It doesn't really matter if on paper the Republicans control literally everything. In fact, they have dominated the formal power structures of the United States on certain occasions. Holding Congress, the Supreme Court, and the presidency, and yet there doesn't seem to ever be any real reversal to the leftward movement. We're always creeping further left, and maybe it slows down sometimes, but it's always the case that if you look at anything within the past 50 years, our point of view now compared to 50 years ago is far to the left, and we know that it's going to be the same way in another 50 years from now. And how do we know this? It's because we just have historical precedent for it. We can look at the history of the United States, and we can see that it doesn't really matter who was elected to office. We're always going to be moving left. The only question really is, are we going to do it slowly, or are we going to do it quickly? That's really the only choice between Republican and Democrats. I mean, this is what progress is. It's this endless leftward movement of the government, and it's very easy to point out. Like I said, basically any topic. You look at religion, like gay marriage and sexual norms, the economy. It's just more and more regulation. No matter how you look at the idea of left and right, where everything is just moving further to the left, to the point where now we're in this phase of transsexuality, and there's just no sign of it going in any other direction. As they say, conservatives are just progressives driving the speed limit.
Yeah, I mean, there are people who, people like Edward Feser, who, to my knowledge, has never read a single thing of, neo-reactionary content. And he's pointed out how, there are 5 stages to to conservative resistance, as he calls it.
Yeah, I did read that.
Yeah. Stage 1, mark my words, if the extreme left had its way, they'd foist X upon us. Those nuts jobs must be opposed. Oh, stage 2, oh my gosh, even thoughtful mainstream liberals favor X. Fortunately, it's still political suicide. Stage 3, X now exists in 45 out of 50 states. Fellow conservatives, we need to learn how to adjust to this grim new reality. Stage 4, X isn't so bad, really, when you think about it. And sometimes change is good. Consider slavery. Stage 5, hey, I was always in favor of X. You must have me confused with a insert paleocon, theocon, Bible thumper, etc. here. But everyone knows that mainstream conservatism has nothing to do with those nut jobs.
Right, exactly. And just to hammer it home, I mean, look at 2016 to 2018. You have Republican-controlled House and Senate and presidency, and effectively Supreme Court as well. And what happened? Nothing, really. I mean, everyone on the right is pretty disappointed by President Trump's performance, and he didn't, become the orange dictator of America. It just time and time again you can find moments like this time and time again throughout American history. Things only really move in one direction. So it's obvious to anyone who's paying attention in the slightest that it doesn't matter how many times you elect Republicans who are allegedly right wing. There's no secondary shadow cathedral. At best, there's just a speed bump in the way of progress.
Yeah, I read Moldbug, and he came up with this and he borrowed a term from 1984, the outer party and the inner party, those terms, and he used them to describe conservatives and liberals. So yeah, uh, going on from there. So I wanted to talk to you about one of the latest videos you did. You made a video on the Groyper phenomenon.
Yeah.
Now, and you explicitly used a Moldbugian framework to take a look at this phenomenon. And now, one would think, given Moldbug's distrust of democracy, that the Groypers, whose ultimate goal is to get more America first candidates elected, wouldn't be effective from a Moldbugian perspective. Yet you had all around rather positive things to say. Could you help me explain this apparent discrepancy?
Well, the Groypers are a very influx phenomenon, so it is hard to say what their goal is. I'm not sure that their goal is necessarily to get more America First candidates into Congress. I mean, maybe that's
Well,
a short-term aim. I mean, that's definitely something they want to do, right? No one would dispute that, but I don't think
I
that's really the
mean,
final intent of the Groypers. I think the intent of the Groyper to construct a more traditionalist American society through whatever means can achieve that. I don't think the Groypers are going to be the end all be all of the dissident right, but I think at least in the short and perhaps medium term, they're a positive development that can help break up the power structure of the outer party. Uh, not as I point out in the video, the reason I'm positively inclined towards the Groypers, or at least one reason, is because they're targeting a lot of the non-democratic institutions like Turning Point and these sort of embedded civil service people, not the actual politicians themselves necessarily. I think that getting America First candidates elected might be mildly or even moderately useful. But as far as the Groypers are looking to achieve that as their end state, I don't really think that is what makes them promising. I think it's purely in the sense that they're destroying the Republican Party, because I really do agree with Goldbug in that basically eliminating the Republican Party and sort of exposing the one party state is really the only viable solution, because that's going to, as he writes in his new work, open up the political core to having public pressure be applied to it and potentially rewire the system in some way.
So I'd say that insofar as you're correct, I do think that, you get the impression from some of them, like Vincent James. You've heard of the Red Elephants, right?
Yeah, people keep saying he's one of the Groypers or Groyper generals, and I didn't really realize that people had that impression of him, but I guess it's true. I don't really watch him, so I didn't realize that he had much to do with Groypers as such.
Yeah, he's been in a few of these kinds of Groyper questioning stuff, and and if you go on Telegram, people like Vincent James, Vincent James and Nick Fuentes, Stephen Frenson, I believe, and
Yes,
Kay Alexander, and Jaden McNeil, I believe. Jaden, one of the people who quit Turning Point. They generally speaking, they all sort of coalesce around each other. And you also have Michelle Malkin, who has been a long time conservative activist who's been harping on about immigration for a long time. She's involved, and and you also have this group called American Identity Movement. They are also in the Groypers, and all of these people are together in sort of in that Groyper space. And I mainly watch Nick Fuentes and Vincent James, and I know. So when I look at them and when I see what they're doing, they do seem to be emphasizing the importance of elections. They tend to go like, elections matter. We need more people elected because otherwise, and they seem to think that the problem is that, the outer party isn't America first enough.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so they would just want to say, if we could elect more Republicans that align with our ideology, we'd get more things done.
So I think they probably do actually think that, but I think what's going to happen is that as they make the Republican Party more America first, more genuinely right wing, they're essentially going to push the Republican Party out of the Overton window and effectively make it a non-viable party, almost like the Libertarians. And I think that's what I find really interesting. I don't think their intent is to destroy the Republicans, but I think they might sort of accidentally, in some sense, end up doing it by trying to force them to be right wing. So I agree with you that I don't think they are necessarily, although they might be, neo-reactionary in their way of thinking. But I do think that, practically speaking, they're probably going to end up simply damaging the Republicans if they're successful, to the point where it's pretty obvious that we'll be living under a one-party system, which is the point at which we could potentially rework the system outside of traditional electoral means. I think if they possibly one of the worst things that could happen is if they are actually moderately successful with America First and they get actual America First Republicans in Congress, and there's this sort of Fabian approach to it, which I don't think can really work in the long run. I think ultimately that's going to be doomed to the same previous attempts at such incremental change. So I'm kind of hoping, I guess I'm hoping in some sense that the Groypers or the America First movement sort of democratically fails at its aims, so that a more useful set of events can happen.
Yeah, I mean, also, in the meantime, they're also creating alternative institutions to the mainstream Republican ones. They have they have AFPAC to sort of counter CPAC. They have America First Students to counter Turning Point USA. They're creating they seem to be creating their own parallel of the Republican Party, and that's going to grow like a cancer within the Republican Party.
Yeah, that's probably the way to go. As far as creating institution goes, I'm always skeptical of them, just because I'm not really sure what the specific utility of any given institution is at this time. We obviously need alternative institutions at some point, but the problem with them is you have this problem where then you start presenting a target to the enemy. And I think one of the reasons the Groypers have been really successful is that it's very difficult for the enemy to target them, because it's kind of just these one-off individuals that you can't really do anything about. And then, of course, Nick Fuentes himself is entirely, fan funded, and there's no advertisers or anything. So I think the Groypers have a sort of resilience to them in that they're decentralized like the cathedral, and there's not really an institution that can be taken down. And that's not to say I'm against building institutions. I'm not. It's just that I'm not sure at which point we need to be focusing very strongly on that over any other particular thing. I know people like the distributists seem to be very focused on building institutions. And of course, he had his Canis Society, and that got taken down by Discord, right? So I think we have to be really careful with, we just need to be very thoughtful about how we go about building these so-called institutions, because it does present an attack vector to the cathedral. And that's a very dangerous thing to do. When the enemy has no way to attack you effectively, you're in a very advantageous position. And as dissidents or rebels, that's an advantage we have that we can exploit. And as soon as we start building these command centers, we present something for the enemy to bring their firepower against.
sorry. Yes, I would say that is always the problem with group action. You know, I mean the whole decentralized approach does have its weaknesses, however, in that all it takes is one bad apple and the entire one spurgy wignat or one undercover federal agent, and the whole thing can just explode in your face.
Yeah, I think that's where the concept of loyalty comes into play and being very clear about real intentions, which I think is something Nick Fuentes does very well. It's important to always maintain plausible deniability on certain wignets like that. If you make it, if it's very clear that, if it's very clear what you and your people are, then it's a lot more difficult to be attacked that way. But of course, the media does this all the time, and you're definitely right. Being decentralized does also have its weaknesses, and I think right now, the dissident right is kind of in this transitionary phase where we're trying to start bootstrapping real institutions around ourselves, and not simply be this decentralized movement. And that's a very difficult and critical moment to be in.
So you would say that your role in this is basically, provide the groundwork for new theories to come after you, right?
Yeah, I'm trying to provide people with new tools and new ways of thinking that they might not otherwise have had available to them, mainly, which I think has been pretty successful. I know a lot of people have sort of discovered Moldbugian or other ideas through my channel, so that's going to just continue to be my focus. Is I sort of view myself as a provider of information more than a theorist in of myself. Although I do try to do a little bit of that, and want to try my hand at providing my own analysis to a more significant degree as I read through materials and learn more myself. A lot of what I do is a learning process for me as well as people who watch the channel. I'm always reading new articles, new books. I don't necessarily make videos on all of it, but all of us are kind of in this together. Whether you're making content, learning from it, doing a show like Nick Fuentes does, or doing stuff like we do. It's a big, massive group effort here on the right, and everyone can have something to contribute. So I'm trying to contribute what I can.
All right. So I'd like to go into briefly this one idea that you told me over on Discord. You explained to me recently that you think that a major problem in the modern day, in the modern times, is that too many people think scientifically when they need to be thinking logically. What do you mean by this?
Well, and this is something I encounter, I guess, IRL very often, where people really only think of, they only really have one method and one really bad method at trying to get at truth. And it's this scientific or pseudoscientific way of thinking where the only way they really are able to seek truth is through, in some sense, method and empirical data, but mostly on the authoritarian pseudoscientific view of knowledge, where you have these, peer-reviewed papers by, white lab coat university people, and they sort of tell you what's true, and people sort of take this stuff as their gospel. And you find this a lot among the, I guess, liberal atheist types, where, we know all of this stuff about biology and human nature, but at the end of the day, it doesn't really provide very good answers to questions, and there's other ways of arriving at knowledge and truth beyond just the scientific method, coming up with these hypotheses and then doing little tests on data points on DNA and all of that stuff, and trying to figure out the nature of human beings. uh, people don't really People aren't really capable of thinking logically anymore, I find. which is a very difficult. It's difficult to learn, and it's really because we aren't taught this way in school anymore. All we're really taught is the scientific method based on empirical observation. But what I mean by logical thinking is sort of arriving at principles and then thinking forward from those principles rather than thinking backwards. You have what the scientific method does is it's really sort of a backwards way of thinking almost. You do come up with hypotheses and predictions, but mainly what you do is you observe things and then you provide some sort of explanation for it scientifically. So it really just explains things and doesn't really help you think forward from some principle. And a lot of people, this makes conversations with people very difficult because they're not really capable of thinking, taking some set of axioms or principles and thinking forward from them. They're only really capable of direct observation and then learning from that, as opposed to sort of building on this set of principles. And I think that's why you see a lot of inconsistency in the thinking of, I guess, normies. And I guess to elucidate this a bit more, one of the things, one really good example of this is, I'll argue with people I know who are atheistic and into the scientific way of thinking and are very into biology, and they'll talk about how humans and animals are the same because we're all just we evolved from animals and we're all based on DNA and there's just electrical signals in our brains and that's what thinking is. And basically the principle you arrive at here is that thinking is just these electrical signals that's happening, and that's all there is to being a human or alive. And if we're the same, if humans are the same as animals based on this principle that if you just have this electrical signaling going on that looks something like thinking, that's your basis for it. Well, Mike, what you can extract from that is, well, okay, so why is a Roomba, for example, not alive? A Roomba clearly thinks in some way, right? It has this sort of same paradigm to it where there's electricity moving around in its circuit board. And why are you a carbon chauvinist? Why is the silicon-based Roomba not alive? And they can't. They wouldn't even conceive of that in the first place because they're just thinking backwards from these scientific observations. And when they arrive at this conclusion, they're not thinking, okay, well, now that I have this idea, what else can I think of from this principle? Well, now I might identify that a Roomba is actually a living being from this, but it would never even occur to most these atheistic scientific thinkers to conceive of that because they're only thinking backwards from their basic observations. And then, of course, why when we talk about moral value, that often comes up a lot in such conversations. I would say that a human has more moral value than an animal. And of course, they would say no, that we're fundamentally the same. So of course, a human doesn't have more moral value than an animal. But again, you can try and reason your way back to some sort of principle here. And if why draw the line at human and animal? Why are you a brain chauvinist? I guess why does a plant not have as much moral value as an animal or a human? And then why stop there? Why doesn't a rock or any material have the same moral value? When everything is just atoms and molecules and energy moving around, from what principle are you actually basing your theory of morality on? You really are standing on nothing at the end of the day. You're kind of just making these arbitrary distinctions that are your preferences. You're not really arriving at any of this from any sort of principled basis. You just have people, in lab coats telling you that humans and animals are the same, and you're not really thinking ultimately about what the real conclusions are of this way of thinking. So I don't know if that was easy to follow or not, but yeah, that's kind of an explanation of that, I guess.
When I hear you talk about those kinds of people, I have to. It reminds me of this one old story, and there was a guy. There was this guy, one physicist, and he was an expert on light. He knew everything about light, and he came across a painter, and this painter said that he could make yellow paint by mixing together red paint and white paint. And the physicist was like, this is not possible. I know everything about light, so you can't really make yellow paint by combining the sort of red and white paint. But the painter was like, well, this can be done. I'm an expert painter. And so the painter showed him how to do this. So he took the painter took the red paint and the white paint and mixed them together. And like the physicist expected, the paint came out pink. But then the painter said that all he needed to do now was add a little bit of yellow paint to sharpen it up a bit, and then it would be yellow. you get yeah, like, and I think that's really what's happening when you have these people who think scientifically, quote unquote, because what they are doing is, I'm an Aristotelian. I believe in the Aristotelian axiom that, all that's from the intellect comes from the senses. We gain our knowledge through sense experience. But by that same token, I do believe that sense experience can play tricks on you if you do not have the right first principles before you go into the sense experience. And so you need to know what your first principles are before you actually, start looking at doing science. And what you find with these physicists is, physicist types, they'll start talking about how the universe can come from nothing according to the laws of quantum mechanics. And then you start going, well, hold on a second. The laws of quantum mechanics aren't nothing, guys. Physics by itself doesn't even tell you what matter is.
Right.
As crazy as that sounds, you need to have a working definition of matter before you can say anything else about it.
Right, and this is something I've encountered in these biological discussions too. My friends will tell me that humans and animals are fundamentally the same, and my question is, well, and in order to say that two things are fundamentally the same, you have to understand what they fundamentally are, and we definitely don't know what a human fundamentally is, and we don't know what an animal fundamentally is, and as you just mentioned, we don't know what matter fundamentally even is. People just assert these knowledge claims.
Well, it's not that we don't know what they are. It's just that you can't know what they are based on the scientific studies alone, because what you need to start with the first principles, because what you end up with otherwise is rather, this is the thing, right? The scientific minded people would say that, they're trying to assume as little as possible in constructing their view of the world. But the problem is that they actually have they're making as many implicit assumptions as you are. They're just smuggling them in.
Right.
They're like the painter who adds a little yellow paint in order to get yellow out of white and red.
Right, and I think this is the problem of not thinking logically, or not being able to think from principles, or to derive what principles you're even using from what you're saying. People, they just don't think about the implications of what they're saying. Often I'll end up in discussions where my friends will make moral judgments. They'll say, this is wrong or something, and I know that they are scientific liberal atheist types who don't even really believe in morality. So how can you as a being make these moral claims without really having any basis for it? But they're not even thinking about it, right? It doesn't occur to people like this that there's some sort of incongruous way of thinking in their head, because they're not thinking in terms of principles ever, really.
All right, so now there comes do you see that there might be like a danger in doing the opposite? Like if you're going from first principles so much that you ignore the actual empirical reality around you. What I'm thinking of is, what I'm thinking of in particular are the vulgar anarchists, the vulgar anarcho-capitalists on YouTube, who will, people like Shane Killian, if you've ever watched him, he got into a debate with people like True Deal Tom and some other ethno-nationalist types. And, you know, on the question of immigration, they're like, well, we have to stick to these fundamental first principles, even in spite of any empirical reality.
Yeah, that's definitely can be equally as bad. And of course, my contention is not that you shouldn't ever think scientifically. It's just that there's multiple paths to acquiring knowledge. And like you said, you're Aristotelian, and Aristotle upholds the value of observations. I mean, he even has a book himself on biology. And of course, you have to make observations and also think scientifically. It's just that you don't want to confine yourself to only one way of thinking. And a lot of modern people only confine themselves to a scientific or really pseudo-scientific way of thinking, where they only take their knowledge, their so-called facts, from the lab coat wearing university people in the cathedral. And that's a very bad way of living in general. You want to be able to access knowledge in as many ways as you possibly can. You know, like most people I know they basically just reject philosophy and metaphysics as legitimate fields of study, even really. Basically just because you can't materially demonstrate them. But that doesn't mean that these aren't completely legitimate fields of study. Yeah, obviously they are. The nature of being is
like
study. You can't really even have any concept of biology without some sort of metaphysical concept of being. You know, biology doesn't tell you what it is to be human. You know, to a pure atheistic, materialistic person, they would just tell you that, you know, to be human is just to be a series of chemical reactions and electrical signals. But that's useless to me. That doesn't tell me anything about the nature of being. You know, a lot of this knowledge that people tout about that they don't even really have, you know, someone just told it to them. It's completely useless to us. And you don't really want to live in a situation where you just have a bunch of useless nonsense knowledge and you reject other actual knowledge that could be useful to you.
I mean, there are people that are, I mean, I think your words, your message it will start to have weight with these kinds of liberal those kinds of atheist types, once they start realizing that institutions like Nature magazine are printing out stuff about how biological sex doesn't exist.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, one of the world renowned biology scientific journal of biology comes out and says, yeah, actually, biological sex doesn't actually exist, guys. You know. And you just have to, and you just having to go roll your eyes and go, oh, you know, what is it? You know, what are these people smoking? You know, and the answer is cathedral. That's what they're smoking.
Yeah, the problem is too is I know so many people who, you know, completely reject all that progressive bunk, but they're still just sort of stuck in this, you know, like basic liberal way of thinking, and breaking people out of that I think will be very effective, but it's a very difficult thing to do because it really requires you to, I guess, as we say, get red pilled, to really peer behind the veil, which most people just won't do, honestly, or won't take seriously.
I honestly agree with Edward Feser that a large part of that is people are accustomed to a lot of the vices of modernity, and you know, the elites purposefully encourage this in the lower classes in a similar way to how there were these bred circuses in the Roman Empire to keep the masses preoccupied. And I've come across people, true story, I've come across people who they dislike the progressives, but they dislike the progressives because they endanger their video games, anime, and pornography.
Yeah, that's
And
what I encountered.
and then when you start having even a mildly conservative critique of their habits, they start spurging out and saying how they need to that they're willing to fight and die for their porn, and how they'll happily join arms with communists to kill you. And it's like, I'm like, well, that just makes you a communist. Then you can't really say you oppose these people if you're not willing if you're not willing to give up what makes you comfortable in order to oppose those people. Because these people control. The entertainment industry is controlled by the cathedral in a large way. It's and it. I mean, it's just kind of insane to me how you can just how you can just have that mindset. I just it's just not logical. Is what I'm
it's
saying.
a really
Not really.
mindset. Yeah, I mean, I
But
encounter this all the time. Again, with my IRL friends, they're mostly just the basic, sort of left libertarian, don't tell me what to do type. Just let me do whatever, and I don't want to bother anyone. Just don't bother me. And it's like, well, okay, but people are coming to bother you, and they don't like the progressives, but all of the actual solutions to the progressives, they get real mad at. Anytime I'm like, well, we need to do this, they're like, oh, you just want to legislate your morality. And I'm like, yes, I do. And that's the only way to win here. Like you pick one, basically. You don't get to have your utopia and eat it too. It's you either take what the progressives have coming, or you actually stand up on some principle and fight against it. But if you just sit here lackadaisically and just enjoy your video games and movies and stuff, everything's just going to get trampled on. So they want to have their system where they can just sit around and do whatever they want, and fair enough, I guess, but they're never actually do anything to defend it, which is so annoying. It would be less annoying if they wouldn't push back against all of the reactionary methods of dealing with the problems of progressives. Because I think ultimately, the more traditional society is just going to be better for everyone to live in, and the progressive nonsense that they're trying to push. You kind of have to pick one, I think. You can't really, for a time we can live, I guess, in this limbo where neither system's really fully in control, and you can kind of just have all of your modern consumption and enjoy it. But the people after you aren't going to have that. They're going to be living in Prague hell, basically. But of course, a lot of people just don't care because they don't have kids or anything even. So that's also a problem.
I'd imagine. You can't really get a drug addict to rebel against the person who's giving him the drugs. That's how I look at it. And the cathedral, or at least some aspect of it, are the people providing these kind of lower class plebs the drugs. It's like Brave New World with Soma. Soma. Anyways, so while we're on the topic of people who are critical of Neoreaction, there was a serious critique of Neoreaction by a guy named Andrew Sullivan. That in a thing called New York Magazine. Now, Andrew Sullivan, from what I can tell, he's this former editor of the New Republic. He published it. He's kind of this conservative. He's a gay conservative. So that should tell you a bit about what you should. That should give you a bit of an idea of what kind of person he is. Gay conservative, supported Obama. Anyways,
Oh God,
so
I'm reading some of this. I'll just quote it. Quote, and how could you seriously regard our political system and culture as worse than ever before in history? How self-centered do you have to be to dismiss the unprecedented freedom for women, racial minorities, and homosexuals? End quote.
yeah,
That's
that was
great for
actually
me. I'm none of that. Thanks.
okay. This is one of the thing. Like, this is the and he, in spite of that, he does say in the article that one should take the neo-reactionary critiques into account and try and to incorporate them into a liberal project going forward, because he thinks that the neo-reactionaries will otherwise cause too much damage to the overall system if the problems they're pointing out aren't addressed by the system itself. But his first critique of the neo-reactionaries is that the neo-reactionaries, a common talking point by Moldbug especially is that if you if you take away all of the technological and scientific progress that happened in the last 100 or so years, the last century is just this obvious failure, and it's only the technological progress that is blinding us to the obvious decay. And he would say, well, hold on a second. There are things that I regard as positive that aren't necessarily technological. For instance, there's the unprecedented freedoms for women, racial minorities, and homosexuals. There's the welfare programs that help the poor, the elderly, and the unemployed. Greater religious toleration, greater racial integration, the lowest levels of violence amongst humans ever recorded. Aren't all of these things unambiguously good, at least compared to what came before?
Yeah, I mean, most that's just not good. I mean, religious tolerance. Ask the Europeans how they're enjoying that right now. Racial integration. How is that good? It's not. It's not fun at all. He's also talking about the absence of world wars. That has nothing to do with liberalism and progressivism. I mean, the friggin' Soviet Union is just as responsible for not having a world war as the liberal democracies of the West are. I mean, it takes two to tango, right? I mean, they also chose to not have a world war, so that's just kind of a nonsense point. And again, here he's just smuggling in all of these moral assumptions, like somehow it's better to just have unprecedented freedom for homosexuals. How's that going? Now we have transsexuals.
Well, it's good.
Trying to...
I mean, he's a gay man,
yeah, right,
so of course he's going to say that.
Of course, it's great for him.
Yeah, it's great for him, but you're just selfish if you
it's
oppose
dumb
that.
how he could even write this. He's like, how self-centered do you have to be? Well, I don't know. Does this guy have to basically live a double life? Like, the amount of psychological stress that comes with being a reactionary basically is just immense. I mean, you literally have to live a double life, and that just fucking sucks. Sorry to curse on your stream, but it's shitty. It's just awful. This guy gets to do whatever he wants. So he's like, well, why don't you not being able to what is this even point? I none of this applies to me. I'm not homosexual. I'm not a racial minority. I'm not a woman. I'm not elderly. I don't want religious tolerance for literally anything. I don't want to be integrated. I mean, none of this.
Well, I mean, on the religious toleration portion, I mean, yeah, there's not these open and there's not this open persecution of Protestants or Catholics, and there's not these religious wars like you had in Europe in after the Reformation. But back then they didn't have an official religion where you have the progressives basically trying to subvert traditional Christian beliefs, and at every turn, and to the point where you have these radical homosexuals just screaming at you how terrible you are if you're a Christian, and trying to cram their liberal views down on you. And Edward Feser talks about this in his in his analysis of the sexual revolution, and the way he puts it in that article is pretty funny. He says let me pull this up. He says there is a kind of Stockholm syndrome among conservative religious believers of a certain mindset which treats modern developments in the sexual revolution as the regrettable but understandable excesses of well-meaning wounded souls who've been done wrong by overzealous and insensitive defenders of traditional morality. In my opinion, this is delusional. If it were true, you'd expect that the shrillness of the revolutionaries would decrease as the rhetoric of tolerance, compassion, and respectful coexistence with those who reject traditional sexual morality has become more prevalent among conservatives and religious believers. Instead, the shrillness has also increased, and dramatically. The more ass-kissing the religious conservatives do, the more they get in return is ass-kicking.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the more kissing we do, the more ass-kicking we get, essentially. So, I mean, and you can also apply that to racial integration, too. I mean, like, nobody really... whenever we have racial integration, I mean, people like Jared Taylor always point out how prevalent white flight basically gives up the lie of racial integration.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty obvious that no one likes it or wants it. I mean, people self-segregate. It's
nobody except. I mean, nobody likes it except for progressives who live in all-white communities but want integration for everybody else. That's the general. That's the only people who like it.
I kind of want to know where this guy lives, because in the next paragraph he talks about how if neo-reactionaries are right, society would have collapsed, and it's like, that's the second critique. That's society the second critique. Are you paying attention? I mean, look at places like San Francisco.
I mean, this was written back in. So
if it was 2007, I'd give him a pass. But come on, I mean, what else? He also mentions, and this is such a silly view, that he mentions that somehow we haven't had a civil war, as if civil war is the only way that society can fail, right? Like, things are not going particularly well. I mean, look at what happened. It's happening all over Western civilization right now. Society is collapsing because of the unprecedented mix of race and cultures. I just don't understand how, from my perspective,
say Andrew Sullivan, say Andrew Sullivan was here right now. What are some things that you would point out to him that are signs that this historically unprecedented mix of cultures is contributing to the collapse of society, for instance?
I mean, I would just point out the obvious racial differences in how well different races maintain societies and what they look like in different parts of the world. I mean, it's pretty obvious that if you want a certain type of European civilization, you need white people to maintain it, and that's just demonstrated time and time again. You look at any major city, what happens. The racial minorities move in, the whites leave, and it falls apart. I mean, that happens all over the Western world. The patterns are just everywhere. It's like I want to come up with some simple way of explaining it, but it's just, to me, it's staring you in the face.
Maybe you can take a look at this.
What do you even say?
Line. Like, there's this one line that that is just a howler, where he says, London is 40% non-white, but its inhabitants are unfazed, and its culture is still world class.
I mean, has he been to London? London is just awful. it's it's a mess. There's knife crime
I
everywhere.
mean, he supposedly lives there, but you know, I just have to wonder, like, what is, like, he seems to be unaware of the fact that London has surpassed. Maybe he could be excused for not noticing this in 2017, but London's crime rates have actually surpassed New York City's, its murder rates, at least. And you know, the London is. I mean, the reason why. I mean, he disparages, like, how, it's not to the liking of the rural parts of Britain, but you know, the reason that it's not to the liking of the rural parts of Britain is because the London upper class is dictating the rest of the country to have the same policies they do, even though their city is basically divided into it's one part Westminster upper class elite and one part, like, gangland, you know, and and you see this in any progressive space, like California, for example. The entirety of California, London is just a microcosm what's happening in California on a statewide level, you know. And I don't really know how this guy could call himself a conservative and really talk about this kind of nonsense in such a blasé fashion. I mean, does he not know I guess he doesn't know the connection. See the connection.
I don't know.
Now,
there's just some fatal flaw in some white people where they just don't view culture or European culture as legitimate or existing.
well, I think that the fact that he's homosexual, and that if he was alive back in medieval times, he would definitely not be tolerated. I think that's a big reason why he hates the West, basically.
Yeah.
In any case,
the crazy thing is like with the homosexuals and stuff, if it's like, it's literally better if you would just keep it in the closet. Like, if they would just chill out, people wouldn't care that much. But they literally have, like, transsexuals in the schools now, you know, touching the kids and stuff. It's like, guys, are you trying to get oppressed? Like, can you just chill, please? You know, I mean, honestly, people aren't going to care that much if you just have your sodomy alone and stop trying to just shove it down everyone's throats all the time. I don't understand the psychology. You know, you have your dumb little liberties now. Can you just chill? Why do you have to ruin it for yourself?
I would suggest reading Edward Feser's article on this, you know, psychoanalyzing the sexual revolutionary. He gives a really good analysis of why they can't just keep it to themselves. Essentially, what happens, to summarize, he points out, to summarize, the first, at least one part of it, is that you know, they can't really control their emotions. Essentially, they can't help themselves. They have to. They have to keep this up because they are more emotionally driven than rationally driven. In any case, the third critique that Andrew Sullivan has of neo-reactionaries is how, you know, a lot of this is more so aimed at the Claremont Review of books, which you know, these kind of Straussian types at the Claremont Review. Now, Claremont does I think Mencius Moldbug is a part of, like, a subsidiary of Claremont, like the American Mind, I think. But this was back in 2017, and he seemed to just kind of lump in Claremont with Moldbug as a neo-reactionary school of thought, even though they're Straussians, and Straussians aren't really reactionaries; they're kind of liberal. Um, the so the so he would say that one of the Claremont Review's critiques of modernity is the modern administrative state and how it's so it's just so all encompassing. The bureaucracy is so all encompassing. It's so micromanaged, and it just seems like because of as Moldbug would say, it's so decentralized. It seems so totalizing. And he says in response that given the complexity of modern society, it makes sense that a class of professional elites are necessary to govern said society because the rulers need a certain amount of expertise. Sure, a disproportionate number of these elites. A lot of these elites are liberals, but so what? Don't these elites know better than you? How could you, some pleb on the internet, know more than they would? Neo-reactionary ideas are underground for a reason. I mean, why should we? They have all these silly ideas like how carbon doesn't cause global warming or something like that. What would you say to that sort of critique?
I mean, if you like living in Clown World, then yeah, you need Clown World experts to maintain it. But it's people have gotten by throughout history without this massive bureaucracy. I mean, the United States functioned well enough under basically federalist principles for, let's say, 100 years or so. I mean, you don't. But
modern society is so much more complex than it was back then.
Yeah, I would just say it doesn't have to be. I mean, there's just no reason you have to. Everyone knows. I mean, just look at how a corporation works. Everyone knows that increasing the micromanagement and bureaucracy basically worsens it and puts it into the client. I mean, I think that's one of the ways Moldbug is sharp, is he uses this corporate analogy that people are very familiar with to the U.S. government. It's obvious if you just view USG like it's a corporation. It's one of the worst corporations that's ever existed. It's dysfunction. It's laughably dysfunctional. I mean, there are obviously, if he's just worried about efficiency, just have absolute government, basically, right? Have a CEO. That's what Moldbug proposes. That's how you get the maximum proficiency out of these complex systems. It's just, you reduce the complexity. He seems to have this idea that there's some sort of inherent complexity in modernity, but that's just because we've built it up. It doesn't have to be that way. If anything, modernity can be simpler than the past due to how easy it is to communicate and spread information. I mean, I think that lends itself to decentralization and smaller, less complex units. Are you there? Might be some connection issues. Yeah. Okay. Oh, that's unfortunate, but let's see. I disconnected a little bit ago, so we'll just wait around for a little bit. Yeah, FBI. Let's see. Anyone in chat have anything to say? Read us. Yeah, I'm reading you. Oh, if Tech Wars could get Moldbug, how hard would it be to get him somewhere else, like maybe Fuentes or Distributist? Who is Tech Wars exactly? It's a podcast, I think. Did Tech Wars have Moldbug on? That'd be really interesting because I didn't know this. I'll have to Google that. So yeah, the idea of interviewing Moldbug or some of these other neo-reactionaries is pretty interesting. It would definitely be really cool to get Moldbug or someone like him on Fuentes or Distributus. I think we could have a really interesting conversation.
I'm so sorry. My my internet has a bad habit of just canceling out.
Yeah, no
I
problems.
apologize. So where were we?
Now I forget because I was reading chat.
I mean, I was.
Oh, we were talking about
the expertise. I think.
Oh yeah.
The particular critique he's leveling at the Claremont people is that the Claremont people don't like how society is run by these experts that are increasingly unaccountable to the average person and do not have the same interests as the average person. And his response to that is basically, well, we need experts to run modern society because modern society is so complex. And, so what if these modern experts are overwhelmingly liberal? Because, neo-reactionary ideas, they're underground for a reason. I mean, they're all very crazy. Have you seen them?
Yes, so I'll just summarize my answer since I gave it in full and I don't want to repeat myself for people who listen in the future. It's basically, modern technology lends itself to decentralization and simplicity, mostly through the ease of transmitting information. There's really no reason things need to be more complex now. If anything, they can much more easily be made simpler, and we just don't need these experts managing things when we have much easier ways of transmitting the information needed to avoid all this micromanagement. Everyone knows that corporations that are micromanaged tend to be less efficient and effective. One of the strengths of Moldbug and Neoreaction is the comparison to the USG with corporations. And I mean, yeah, anyone who knows anything about business knows that this massive complexity and bureaucracy is unnecessary and bad, and we can get rid of it. I mean, there's no argument that there's some sort of inherent complexity when it kind of seems like the opposite is true. Really, I mean, if you look at any corporation.
The fourth and final critique that I managed to glean from this article is that the neo-reactionary solutions to the problems we have are really radical and they have no chance whatsoever of coming into existence and would be reckless. And even if we did have the power to put them into existence, it would be reckless to attempt them. I mean, how can we reset the American government and turn it into a monarchy? How are we going to preserve the white majority? How can we stop global manufacturing patterns? These seem to be rage-fueled fantasies rather than realistic policy proposals.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of that is probably valid criticism, but my response would be maybe you should have thought of that before you put transsexual pedophiles in preschools. I mean, what do you expect people to do, right? Like, so when you have radical problems, people are going to start proposing radical solutions when none of the other solutions we're supposed to be using actually work. I think Moldbug presents a pretty reasonable path of transitioning modern society to a neo-cameralist system. I mean, I think a lot of what the U.S. government does, a lot of this alleged complexity, you could just chop like 80% of it off. The government just doesn't need most of its functions. I think we have this idea that somehow life is just stitched together by the government and everything's just going to fall apart if it disappears. But I don't think we need the federal government in the capacity that he seems to think we do.
All right. Well, finally, my final question to you, and thank you for being patient with me and answering those critiques. I just thought it would be interesting to get for a neo-reactionary to sort of take on one of the critics that says, "Well, we need to take neo-reactionary seriously, guys."
Yeah, that was pretty fun. I mean, he has a point about the radicalism. It's just that we're in. I don't think neo-reactionaries enjoy that. It seems like we need very radical solutions to the problem of modernity, but we're just sort of backed into a corner at this point. There's no path within the system as it exists that can actually produce the kind of change that we're looking for. So what are we left with?
Yeah, I mean, and also there's this kind of tone in Sullivan's where there's like this implicit message that the problems neo-reactionaries point to aren't actually problems, and that's another thing that I really think that is a huge problem with the cathedral. It's like they just don't want to admit that there are actual problems. Like there are plenty of like moderate liberal types that are willing to admit, yes, there are these huge problems. Maybe the moderate liberals don't have the best solutions, but they're at least willing to say, yes, there is a problem with this, this, and this. But a lot of the people, they are just like, no, there's no problem. What are you talking about? There's totally no problem, guys. And it just kind of it's just that kind of dishonesty is a huge part of why I'm not a leftist, really. I mean, besides the fact that they don't really, I don't think someone from my values would be welcome on the left.
Yeah.
In any case, so what, I mean, I don't mean to put you on the spot here, but what do you think will happen in the future, given all the problems we're seeing right now? What do you foresee happening in the year 2020?
In the year 2020, I think we're probably going to see the biggest clown show in American politics that anyone's ever dreamed of in the Democratic Party. Bernie Sanders is going to lose the nomination. I don't think he's going to be nominated as the Democratic candidate, even though it's obvious that that's what the voters want, because the system just isn't going to tolerate him. He is he is a progressive, but he's not really part of their system. There's sort of this neoliberal corporatist ruling order, and they're going to make sure they stay in charge no matter what. I think Trump is probably going to beat whoever runs against him. I don't think any of the Democrats that currently stand really have a chance against him. I mean, he could blow the race, but I think it's pretty much his to lose at this point. So I think that's going to be a very entertaining clown show. But other than that, I expect we'll continue to just see a sort of slow burn co-opting of Trump by the cathedral, and pretty much nothing of interest is going to happen this year other than the pure spectacle of the elections, honestly. I wouldn't be surprised if we see in the UK the Conservative government continue to implement progressive or Labour policy, as that seems to be what they're doing now that Brexit was finally shoehorned through. I think that's pretty much all you're going to expect out of that government. Everything else is just going to be leftwards from there. As far as continental European politics go, I don't really have much knowledge on what's going on there. So I can't really comment there. But yeah, I don't think 2020 is really going to be that interesting from any white pilling perspective. I mean, I guess what will be the most white pilling, I suppose, is if, like I said, the Groypers or some sort of similar America First right wingers can actually make themselves in some way electorally significant or known. I mean, I'm hoping this year we can actually build up some sort of institutions. I think we're going to see a lot of that this year, mostly from the America First side of things. I think they're going to try and possibly fail in a few ways at trying to build up, college level organizations and that sort of thing. I'm hoping, at some point they're going to need some support from older generations. There's no way a pure, youth movement is simply going to somehow carry America into an entirely new phase of existence. I mean, they have a lot of important energy, but obviously they're a very small minority of people, and at some point they're going to have to contend with real power. Up until this point, the Groypers have very entertainingly and successfully sort of combated the lackeys of people with real power, and it might be interesting to see what happens in the election season if some of these people start trying to come up against these truly dark and Machiavellian forces. So maybe that won't happen this year. Maybe that'll be 2021 or even later. But I think that'll be very interesting to see when that happens. Because, I mean, the Groypers are very cool and they've been successful, but, Turning Point USA are pretty small fries in the grand political game. And they're just, lackeys. They're not, they don't really have that much power in of themselves. And it'll just be interesting, I guess, from a sort of realpolitik perspective to see what actually goes down when they start pushing the serious buttons.
All right, then. So now we have our comment of the video, and that is Jared Roberts saying, "What did you all think of Keith Wood's recent critique of nationalism and capitalism?" Well, Roberts, I don't actually watch Keith Woods. What about you, Charlemagne?
Yeah, I don't really watch him either, so I don't know what the specific critique is. I mean, I could kind of guess a little bit. I know Morgoth has sort of critiqued, I guess, the petty nationalism of modern British politics, and I think Keith Woods probably shares a similar view, where it's the sort of humdrum like bulldog nationalism, or Churchill nationalism, that's sort of just like this gung-ho football type mentality, as opposed to truly being nationalistic in the sense about caring about your nation and your people. It's more of a spectacle. So I've seen that sort of criticism of nationalism before. I think it's somewhat valid, but I think it's also good to sort of have these spectacle symbols, even if they're not really what your ultimate aim is. I mean, it's kind of fun. I think you need some fun in life and politics. As far as the critiques of capitalism go, I mean, I find these kind of boring in general. Honestly, I just find critiques of capitalism and socialism just really boring. We've been through it all already. Everyone kind of, I feel like the critiques of capitalism are often misplaced as critiques of the current neoliberal order, the very the sort of capitalism driven by a certain type of people who we're not supposed to mention on YouTube. Those are very good critiques, I suppose, but I don't know. It's just kind of tiresome. All economic systems, I mean, that's just kind of not really the problem at the moment. I mean, I don't know. I would just say I'm bored with it. I'm bored with talking about capitalism and socialism. Who cares anymore? I mean, I think the nationalism versus globalism thing is the much more important one.
All right, then. Well, I think this has been a great talk, and I hope to be able to talk to you again sometime. This is Mr. Geocon signing off.
Cool.
And all right, and
yeah, it's been good.
Have a nice day, guys.